Hi, George.
Hello.
It's been a while.
Yeah, a couple of weeks, I guess.
So we've been bringing in these stars from the blogosphere.
Yeah. Bob says that's good because then they'll blog about it, and I guess that's a way to get more viewers.
That's right. I mean, this is all really about building traffic. The actual substance of what we discuss is not that important.
Yeah, that's my impression. Yeah, I kind of sympathized. Did you see the dialogue that Joel Achenbach did with Bob?
Yeah, I did. I
Joel expressed sort of some of my opinions about this whole web blogosphere thing, the dark side of it. I mean, a lot of it I think has some good points, and Sean and I talked about how great it is getting this raw material and watching scientists discuss these ideas and argue while they're still fresh and unpublished and unpackaged. But on the other hand, if it's all just about getting hits and people writing things off the top of their heads instead of doing reflective kinds of essays, then it's not so good.
Well, my sense is that quality still gets rewarded. God, that sounds so naive when I put it that way. But that if a site is good and it has a high signal-to-noise ratio, then it will attract more readers.
Yeah, I think that's true. And what Sean's doing are kind of like mini essays. And,
he's very impressive, that guy.
Yeah.
I could see him being the next great physics popularizer. He's young, right? He's only, 35 or so?
Yeah, 40 maybe at the most. And God, now that we call that young now.
Yeah. Well, he looks startlingly young in contrast to our old grizzled selves. Anyway.
I know. 50 was tough.
Yeah. So I wanted to tell you about something that just happened at my home here this week. In fact, just 2 days ago. My wife, Susie, as you know, is a wild bird rehabilitator. She's been doing that for, really for about 17 years in all. For the first 10 with a raptor center north of here, but for about the last 7 years here at our house. She has her own operation.
Yeah, right, a huge flight cage and clever tool-making crows and things.
That's right. So the flight cage is right here next to my office, and she's got a little clinic right next to the flight cage where she takes care of birds that are really seriously injured. So we've had all these strange and wonderful creatures come through our home, and it's had a big impact on the family, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And Susie has just finished a memoir about it. It's taken her about 2 years to write, and it took that long because basically she's so busy taking care of birds that she had hardly any time to write.
Yeah.
But she just finished this thing, and she gave it to an agent about a month ago. And 2 days ago, he held an auction. There was intense interest in this book from some really major publishers. And at the end of Wednesday, HarperCollins ended up buying the book. And it's going to be published, I hope, either next spring or sometime within the next year. So I'm just...
that's great, John.
I'm just thrilled
Susie,
to death.
congratulations.
Because I read the book after she finished it a couple of months ago, and I loved it. But of course, you never know.
Yet?
Pardon me?
You have a title yet?
There are a few titles.
You may not want to talk about that.
Well, actually, I think that the working title right now is Flyaway Inc., which is the name of her nonprofit. That was actually her agent's idea. So I guess that will be the title until her publisher tries to convince her to come up with a different title.
Yeah, they always have their own ideas.
That's right.
Yeah,
but
that's great, and the book's actually already written.
The book's already written, and
that must
it's
be
just
a wonderful feeling. I mean, usually, you sell a book, and then you think, oh, this is so wonderful, you're so excited, and then you realize you have to write the damn thing.
That's right. Yeah, in this
years
case...
and years then go by, and they eke out your advance and small little dribbles, and if the book is done and sold.
The book is all done, so it just has to go through a light editing process, and they may or may not have illustrations, but it's just... what I love about it is that it's got all these really close observations of these animals, and the birds are just so much more interesting and idiosyncratic close up than you can possibly imagine. And but it also describes how this passion of hers affects the family in ways that are both positive and sometimes negative, because it's such a huge burden that she has trying to take care of all these birds.
Yeah.
And especially baby songbirds. She doesn't do those anymore, but she did them when she started, and she would get 3 or 4 baby, well, in one case, actually 6 baby blue jays all at the same time. They'd just been hatched. Their parents had been killed somehow. And you have to take care of, you have to feed them 20 minutes, every 20 minutes.
Oh my
for
God.
12 hours a day, 7 days a week.
That's more than human babies, right?
So it's much more.
Yeah. And you've
So
done
Susie would have to take these things around with her, because she's got things to do, places to go. She would pack these things into a big basket and take them around with her. I remember her at a lacrosse game of my son, and the boys are all playing lacrosse, and there's this crowd of parents and other kids on the sideline, and everybody was clustered around Susie while she was feeding these little tiny baby blue jays, because she had no choice. Yeah.
A little bottle. And
yeah.
How they do it, or I guess you have to use an eyedropper.
This was, I think it starts with an eyedropper, then when they get a little older, she feeds them with tweezers. She starts feeding them solid food.
Oh, I see.
So it's very
there must be
tasty.
just all kinds of wonderful stories all interwoven. And
Yeah, there's. I mean, she talks, for example, about this crow behavior. It was totally mysterious to her at first. Crows. She had this one crow, George. She's the crow I've actually talked about in previous.
Oh, the one that tried to trap you in the flight cage.
The one that successfully trapped me in the flight cage.
Oh, yeah.
And she noticed that George was lying on his back in our backyard, wriggling around. And when she went up closer, she saw that there were ants running all over his body. And she couldn't figure out what this was. What's great about what she does now is that she's part of this whole community of other birders and rehabilitators. So she described this behavior of George to these other people, and it turns out that this is something that crows do. It's called anting.
Anting?
They like to lie in a little ant nest and have the ants run all over their bodies. And now the explanation is that the ants have formic acid coating their bodies, and this rubs off on the crow's feathers, and this has anti-parasitic properties. But this gets into proximate versus ultimate explanations. I guess that's the ultimate explanation. The proximate explanation is that it tickles the crow. It feels good. It's fun.
Yeah.
And so that's why they do it. So Susie
it
has this.
turns out to be good for them, and then crows that are more ticklish would tend to survive because they're more likely to lie there and let the ants have their way with them, and then they get this anti-parasite coating.
Yeah.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, it's just why sex feels good. We have sex not because it propagates the genes, although maybe there are some religious people who do it for that reason, but because it feels good. That's the proximate reason, and the ultimate reason, of course, is...
But I don't think it helps with parasites.
No, well, although, actually, the reason for sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual reproduction is thought to be, at least in part, because it creates more genetic complexity, and it means that parasites have a harder, especially bacterial parasites, have a harder time attacking us.
What do you suppose the ants get out of it with the crows?
I'm not sure if the ants have much choice. So the ants are just sort of sitting there.
I wonder, maybe they're farming aphids on the crows like they do on rose bushes.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure an evolutionary biologist would have an explanation that includes the ants' interest as well as the crows.
I'll have to look into this. It's called anting, A-N-T-I-N-G?
Anting.
So
You
crows
put it,
and anting.
plug in anting and crow in Google, and I'm sure you'll find some some explanation of it. You know, another issue that Susie's book deals with that to me makes it.
Crows.
Yeah.
University of New Mexico Library.
Oh, you already found it.
Wow, the first hit. Anyway, didn't mean to.
Well, I was just going to say, there's sort of this philosophical, ethical issue that her book takes up too that I think is really interesting. I think of it as the drop in the bucket problem. So she's trying to, she's taking care of injured crows and starlings, other songbirds, and one by one. And statistically, what she does is absolutely meaningless. So why does she do it? Well, I guess the proximate cause would be because she's in love with these animals. She can't help but do it. But, she's thought about why she does what she does. And in the book, she tries to justify it in larger terms beyond her own personal need. Right. And what she comes up with is that it has a symbolic importance. So when people see that she is putting all this care into into rehabilitating a single robin, it makes them realize it makes them care. It makes them give more value to these birds, and that has sort of a ripple effect. At least so.
Well, and you're injecting a good meme into the memosphere. That will propagate, and other people will do beneficial things like that, I guess.
Well, and the book is the best way of spreading this meme. So what I hope is, Susie this job is overwhelming for her, especially in the summer right now. And, because there are very few wild bird rehabilitators. So she gets people coming from 50, 60 miles away with injured birds or baby birds.
They just show up, so like you're getting ready to go play tennis or something.
Yeah.
And then someone will be dropping off a vulture or something.
That's right. Wow. Vulture. She just had a broadwing hawk that came in this week. I hope that this book will inspire all these other people to become wild bird rehabilitators.
Wow, that'd be great.
So it'll mean that Susie will have less work to do ultimately.
I'll tell some of my birder friends in Santa Fe about it. There's a lot of people here who are really into bird watching.
Oh, good. Yeah.
It sounds like a natural, something like this. It seems like could really catch on.
I hope so. 60 million birders in the United States, supposedly.
Wow.
So we'll see if we can tap into that.
1 in 60 buy the book. You're set.
Yes, definitely. Maybe I can give up writing.
Yeah.
Just stick to video blogging.
Yeah. Oh God, that'd be awful.
So.
Good. Well, give Susie my congratulations. That's really wonderful news.
Thank you. I will. Just on a slightly related note, did you see that article in the New Yorker on, let me see, what was it called? An Earth Without People?
Oh, was that in the New Yorker?
Excuse me, in Scientific American.
Yeah, it was an interview that Steve Mirsky, who's an editor and a humor columnist, he did an interview with someone who wrote a book called An Earth Without People.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Alan Weissman.
Yeah.
Well,
it sounds fascinating.
Yeah, the reason this caught my eye is sorry to keep going on about my wife, but Susie is she's very misanthropic, and a lot of the birds she gets have been are injured because of humans. They've been hit by a car, they've been shot in some cases, they've run into a window or a power line, so either directly or indirectly humans are causing this harm. So Susie often fantasizes about a world in which all humans have vanished, and it goes back to nature. The world goes back to nature without humanity, and we actually get in these arguments because I'm not as misanthropic as she is, and I think humans, for all their faults, make existence interesting. In fact, because of our faults and weaknesses, we make existence interesting because we have free will and choices. But this article seemed to be an imagination of the world without people that was just perfect for Susie. I mean, it's really sort of this fantasy that she's been trying to convince me to accept, and it had some really interesting stuff in it.
It's interesting to think about, and it's a great idea for a book. And just from reading Mirsky's Q&A with Alan Weissman, it sounds like he spends a certain amount of the book just walking around New York City and imagining what New York City would look like. Not if people had never existed, obviously it wouldn't be there, but if suddenly, for some inexplicable reason, all the humans were wiped out, like by, say, a blast of radiation or some horrible virus, and then suddenly, the city was there, and then it would just slowly disintegrate, and then he imagines how that would happen. And one thing that struck me was that I guess constantly there are these pumps below ground in New York City that are pumping underground rivers so that they don't flood the subway tunnels and all of the underground electrical and plumbing infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing that would happen was, of course, we'd run out of energy because people wouldn't be stoking the power plants, and then the pumps would go down, or the pumps would just fail because they'd burn out a bearing, and then the water would start filling up from underground.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me. That had never occurred to me that would be an almost immediate consequence.
Yeah, entropy. That's what's so interesting. You think, really, civilization is just a matter of, we have all these little entropy pumps, not just water pumps, but they're basically pumping out entropy and trying to create these little pockets of temporary order. It's like, remember the old story about Maxwell's demon?
Yeah.
And the idea that you can defeat the second law of thermodynamics if you have this little demon who's, I guess I should explain the whole thing, where you imagine you have, let's say a dumbbell-shaped kind of glass flask, and you fill it full of gas, and thermodynamics tells you that the most likely state is going to be this random distribution of the gas molecules inside. They'll just go where they go and even themselves out over the whole flask and the left side and the right side. So then you imagine that you station a little demon in the neck there, and every time the demon sees a molecule that's randomly zipping one way, he opens a little door and shepherds it into one side of the flask, and when he sees one going another way, he ignores it. And after a certain amount of time, he will have built up this order, and there'll be more molecules moving one way, or I guess what it is in the end is there'll be more molecules on one side of the flask than the other, so he's kind of defeated this natural tendency toward entropy just with his little intelligence and good endeavors.
Yeah, and there's really, it turns out that, I guess the Maxwell's demon thought experiment led to all sorts of elaborations over the next century, and as far as I know, and it's related to computation and some of the energy required for computation, and even the erasure.
Like Landauer and out your way, the late Landauer and Charles Bennett up at the IBM Watson Research Center that dealt with Maxwell's demon. And I guess the original idea was that by injecting information in the system, because you have this, the little demon could be replaced by a computer and an automatic gate, the question was whether information could defeat the second law of thermodynamics and the natural move toward entropy. And what they finally realized was that the operation of the demon, whether it's a demon or a computer itself, creates more entropy than it counteracts. So right. In the end, you always lose. The demon always loses, and entropic tides flood over, and the subway tunnels of New York fill up, and the whole city crumbles.
That's where, we're talking about the second law of thermodynamics, which used to worry people a lot more than it does now. I've got this little book somewhere in my library by Norbert Wiener.
Oh yeah, the cybernetics guy.
Yeah, so he wrote a book that was basically a meditation on the second law and the inevitability of entropy and disorder, and it was incredibly depressing. And it ended up being this kind of tragic declaration of, or sort of heroic insistence on the importance of human striving in the face of this inevitable defeat and failure that is decreed by the second law. It's the most amazingly depressing little book, and this was also an obsession of what's his name, the novelist who wrote Thomas Pynchon, Gravity's Rainbow.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And all those books. He was really worried about entropy as well. But
I don't really get it. I mean, why people would be depressed about entropy. I mean, obviously it says that in the long run, we lose and everything will be random and disorderly. But in the meantime, by expending energy, you can create all these structures and interesting things, and places where everything isn't just this homogeneous gas, but you can have books and art and museums and music and bird sanctuaries and things like this. So it seems like he must be. I mean, Wiener was kind of a naturally depressive person anyway.
Yes, so I've heard. Yeah, he's the guy who coined, I forget if he just said this, but I'll say it again. He coined the term cybernetics, which is sort of a precursor and overlaps quite a bit with information theory, which was created by Claude Shannon at around the same time in the 1930s.
And that was done in a very optimistic spirit, though, cybernetics, this idea that we controlling systems. And there was a really good book. It was kind of a dual biography of Wiener and John von Neumann.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember. I'll have to look for the title, but it was called something like Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann and the Technologies of Life and Death. And the conceit was that Wiener, the cybernetics, represented the technologies of life and understanding and controlling information, and John von Neumann, of course, connected with the hydrogen bomb, and or I guess both the atomic and the hydrogen bomb, I think, wasn't he? But anyway, it was good stuff.
I think both, but he was more associated with the hydrogen bomb.
Yeah,
and he also helped to create. I think he originated cellular automata, which are still a widely used form of computer modeling.
Yeah, that's right. I'd forgotten about that. He's a really interesting guy. I once thought about writing a biography of von Neumann. Because, apparently one of the things he would do, he would drive around the hills around Princeton at very high speeds after drinking large amounts of alcohol, just as sort of a fun experiment.
I remember, I think he was called, he had some nickname that suggested he was an alien. He was so brilliant.
Oh, yeah, he was Hungarian.
Yeah.
And it fit into that fantasy that Hungarians are really from Mars, and that's why their language is so strange and unrelated to most of the other languages of the world. Although
and I guess there was
Finnish, apparently.
And there was this whole generation of Hungarian emigres, including von Neumann and Edward Teller.
Teller, Szilard.
Another evil genius. Edward Teller, who was the supposedly the model for Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove
in the movie.
Yeah, I recently rewatched that. That's really wonderful.
But
we're kind of rambling here. But to get back to this piece in Scientific American,
Earth Without People. Some of the other fun facts that it mentions. It talks about some of the things that will happen over different periods of time that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So within 7 days of a loss of power, you'd have a meltdown of nuclear reactors, which is a little disturbing to me because I've got Indian Point just down the Hudson River from me here. Of course, if I'm gone, then it wouldn't really matter.
Yeah, that's right.
But there would be these highly toxic effects in some cases that result from the disappearance of humans.
Yeah.
Bridges would start crumbling within 300 years or so. That would include the George Washington Bridge. I guess the big arch bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge would take a little longer.
He really went into details, like understanding the engineering and what would last. And
Plastics would last for a long time.
Oh yeah, and all those plastic grocery bags. I guess that's part of what's would jam up. Something about that jamming up the sewer pipes in New York, so the whole sewer system will back up.
Yeah, all these non-biodegradable things. The reruns of television shows, and they picked the Twilight Zone for an illustration in the article, would of course keep propagating through the universe for trillions of years. So even after the Earth is extinguished, when the sun blows up into a red giant 5 billion years from now, the television shows that we created billions of years earlier will still keep propagating through the universe, which is sort of strangely reassuring, I think.
Yeah, and they get weaker and weaker, though, but, the inverse square law. But with a sensitive enough receiver, some alien could receive them, and then they would at least see that they're getting some kind of pattern signal, so their own SETI project would say, aha, intelligence in the universe, but they might not, be able to tell that it's the Lucy show.
Right. Well, they would have people whose jobs it was to figure out what these strange signals meant.
It's always interesting because, there's also, there's these satellites they sent up periodically that, like one of them would have a digital recording of Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg variations, and things like this. And the idea was that someone like the kid sitting by the stream fishing and then sees the bottle with the note in it kind of floating down. There'll be this alien out there somewhere who will see the satellite floating around, or the space probe, I guess I should say, and then we'll snatch it out of space and open it up, and then find this disk, and it's obviously something manufactured because it's geometrical, it's circular, but then they have to figure out. This is what I don't understand. They'll have to figure out how to make a DVD player or a CD player. So we'll have to figure out the encryption scheme in which it was compressed to put on the disk in the first place. So they would have to reverse engineer all of this stuff without any context of the civilization in which it was designed. And then even if they can do this and then they can play the music, you have to wonder, is this going to sound like music to them, or do they have a concept of music, or do they have the pentatonic harmony scale? To what extent are these things ingrained in the universe, and to what extent are they cultural inventions?
Right. And of course, we'd also have to have a description of the highest achievement of human science, superstring theory, which these aliens may or may not have discovered.
Yeah, well, and even if they did discover something, principle similar, you just wonder, if they would have formulated it in any way. I mean, theoretically, it would map onto string theory, and they would be just two different perspectives on the same elephant. But I don't know.
Well, we could also, why not encapsulate DNA as well as some kind of instruction manual for producing a human organism out of DNA, along with diagrams of proteins and the genetic code and sort of materials and the instructions for recreating the human race.
Yeah.
As long as we're sending DVDs of Glenn Gould out there, why not also send whatever is necessary to recreate ourselves?
Well, maybe they are, but how would you write the instructions in a way that anyone would understand them?
Well, maybe you wouldn't need that if it's you could just put some human cells in the equivalent of amber. You know how the conceit of
like the ants.
And the conceit. What's the Steven Spielberg movie with the dinosaurs?
So you'd basically have a seed.
Yeah,
of some sort that you wouldn't need instructions, and if they just opened it up, it would take over. It would be like this invading virus, except it would be human DNA.
One sort of odd thing I thought that this article, an odd suggestion that this article had was that so if humans disappear, I guess one question would be, could any other species acquire our kind of intelligence, an intelligence capable of creating really advanced culture, science, the arts, literature, and so forth? And the species that he picked is baboons, as most likely to take our place. And what surprised me about this is that baboons are certainly not the most intelligent primates, non-human primates. Chimpanzees are supposed to be much more intelligent. I guess they have the biggest brains, but they're not nearly as good at cooperating and sharing as we are. Yeah. So I remember Robert Sapolsky, he's this wonderful scientist out at Stanford who spent a lot of time studying baboons. He described how baboons sometimes, if you've got two baboons chasing an antelope, it's to their advantage to cooperate so that one can head off the antelope in one direction and the other one comes at it from behind. But Sapolsky says that often what happens, the two baboons are galloping after the antelope, and then one looks over at the other and thinks, "You're not going to get it before me," and he lunges at his buddy and starts tearing him apart, and of course the baboon then takes off.
Oh, so Weissman thinks that the baboons are more likely to fill the niche that humanity vacates because they're so ruthless?
Well, no, I guess because they have... I mean, this is just a little tiny box in the article. Maybe his book explains it in more detail. I guess because in terms of sheer volume, and I didn't realize this, they have the biggest brains of any non-human primate.
Well, in that case, it'll be worse then. We'll have this baboon civilization, and they'll take over New York City and figure out how to get the pumps running again, except they'll be really mean and always attacking each other. So crime will just be a huge problem.
It reminds me of, the book On Human Nature by Edward Wilson. Came out about 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I was just flipping through it recently, looking for factoids and quotes. And he talked about baboons, and he's got this line where he says that, and he talks about how vicious they are and how they, they're so selfish that they just, they fail to cooperate even in situations where it would be to their interests. And Wilson says that if baboons had nuclear weapons, they would destroy the earth within a week.
Wow.
So,
wow. This is all I'm starting to think of Planet of the Apes. In fact, I see that they mentioned that here in the sidebar, who might replace us.
Yeah, except I think those were supposed to be...
They were
actually, I guess it was...
chimpanzees, maybe.
Yeah, I think it was supposed to be kind of a hybrid monkey-chimp baboon.
Yeah. God, that movie just blew me away. I must have been in high school. I remember seeing it in a drive-in movie theater in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
And the last scene where he's on the beach and then he sees the Statue of Liberty that's fallen over in the muck. And
that was awesome.
Oh,
Charlton Heston.
This is a great genre, this whole post-apocalyptic literature. There's a book, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein.
Yeah.
She wrote a book called The Last Man, I think, or something like this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's see if I can find it here. And it sounds really interesting. Again, it's this idea that, humanity is inexplicably wiped out, and then, and then what happens is our civilizations crumble. This was a great theme of some, I guess it was Victorian era paintings, where they would have these paintings of Roman and Greek ruins that were all being overgrown with trees growing out of the cracks and things.
Yeah. I remember I loved when I was a kid. I couldn't get enough post-nuclear Holocaust science fiction.
Yeah, great stuff.
Very chilling, but strangely attractive for a screwed up 12-year-old boy.
Oh no, I read all that stuff too, and I wasn't screwed up.
So
I just found that Mary Shelley's The Last Man. The whole thing is on the web.
Uh-huh. Oh, great. You'll have to put a link to that on.
Yeah, I'm the native of the sea-surrounded nook, a cloud and shadowed land, etc., etc. I think I'd rather read it on paper, though. I think I'll get it at the library this weekend. And it sounds good. I think we talked about this before, but not on Blogging Heads. But you know this guy David Markson, right?
Yeah, right. Oh, I can't believe you brought him up.
Yeah, he wrote this book. I actually, at the last section of my book, The Fire in the Mind, I have my own post-apocalyptic fantasy. It's called The Ruins of Los Alamos, and I'm climbing on some cliffs around Los Alamos National Laboratories, and there's these old Anasazi ruins, and then I'm speculating on what it would be like after Los Alamos is gone and the computers are still running for a while, and all this data's there without any context for anyone to decipher it. And at some point there, I got into Markson's novel. It's called Wittgenstein's Mistress.
I totally forgotten that.
Yeah, it's on my shelf. I just found it today. It's sitting next to Wittgenstein's Nephew and Wittgenstein's Vienna.
Yeah.
In my Wittgenstein section. But the idea there is you're never told why, but you're suddenly plunged into this world where there's this woman, and she's the last person on Earth, apparently. And there's no signs of any other dead people around. There's just, this unoccupied planet and all these, if I'm remembering this right, I read this years ago. And then she'll just take a car that still has fuel in it and is still running, and she'll drive as long as she can until it stops, and then gets out, and she listens to the tapes that are in the tape player, and she starts, and she lives in all the great museums of the world. I can't remember how she crosses the oceans, or if that's even explained, but she lives in the Louvre, and the Tate, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there's all this, I'm not sure what the point of the novel was at all, but it got me thinking about, do any of these paintings have any meaning once the last person on Earth is gone, or do you have to have this whole context of this, this series of accidents and contingencies that led to our history and our civilization and our culture for these to have any meaning? Do they have any meaning when they're not embedded anymore? It just fascinates me.
I must have told you that David Markson has been a very important person in my life. So
I thought I remembered there was a connection. What is it?
Well, my wife Susie and I both took a creative writing course at Columbia in 1982 with David Markson. That's where Susie and I met in this guy's class.
Oh.
And so at that point, he was I don't know. He must have been in his late 50s then. 'Cause he's about 80 now.
Yeah.
And he was. We would spend the first. It was a 2-hour course once a week. We'd spend the first hour going over people's stories, and then the second hour he would always just tell these tales from his own life. Usually, descriptions of heroic drinking bouts with other writers. He was a friend.
Yeah, that's what I thought. He would hang out in the village, right?
That's right.
And the crowd in the 50s.
Yeah, sort of the post-Hemingway. These kind of macho writers with poetic souls, very heavy drinkers, womanizers, and Markson always started by telling us how great things had been at this one period of his life. He had written a novel called The Travels of Dingus McGee.
Oh.
It was a kind of a Western about a young man's coming of age, and it was optioned to Hollywood and made into a movie with Frank Sinatra. who at the time was about 50 years old, playing a character who was supposed to be about 18 in the novel. And it gave Markson enough money so that he could go down to Mexico, and he worked on a book about Malcolm Lowry, the British novelist who was the character Under the Volcano. So, but then Markson went through the money, and he said that to torment him for years after the movie The Travels of Dingus McGee came out, his friends would call him at 3 in the morning and say, "David, turn to Channel 5. They're running The Travels of Dingus McGee." Just to piss him off. But so then Markson would always end up telling us that here's entropy again, that the life of a novelist always ends in humiliation and defeat and poverty and disease and loneliness. So here are all these young would-be writers who are kind of listening in horror to this person who had been very successful tell us about the grim realities of life for even a successful novelist. And,
that's, Saul Bellow didn't die that way.
No, he didn't. Well, the irony is that, so Susie and I ended up getting married, and we've stayed in touch with David over the years. And so when I first, my first book came out, I got it was reviewed in the New York Times. I got a little postcard from David saying, "Good job." So I periodically, if I get something published, David writes me and I write him back. And then, he's had this string of books that have come out recently.
There's a new one I just see.
Yeah, there's one that just came out called The Last Novel.
The Last Novel, yeah.
And he's all of a sudden being rediscovered, and he's more successful now than he ever was.
That's great.
The Last Novel just got a rave review in the New York Times,
so just looking at it.
And New York Magazine, it just had a feature on great unknown or underappreciated books. Mm-hmm. And the number one underappreciated book is The Last Novel by David Markson. So I wrote to David, saying, congratulating him on all his success, and he said that actually life is pretty good for him. He's got a young girlfriend now. He's thinking, in spite of the title of his last book, The Last Novel, he's thinking that he is going to write another novel.
Wow.
So I'm just so happy for this guy.
He's 80, it looks like, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, there's this myth about novelists that they're sort of like physicists, that they all their best work comes by the time they're 40 or 50, and after that it's just repeating themselves. But David is a refutation of that.
Yeah, and then, there's some other notable exceptions, like Philip Roth. I think the best stuff he's done has been in this later stage, the whole trilogy that he did with I Married a Communist and American Pastoral. But,
he's as creative as ever.
Yeah.
So it's
well, I'm really interested. So I'll add this to my reading list too, along with The Last Man by Mary Shelley. The Last Novel by David Markson.
The Last Novel by David Markson. Yeah, Susie and I are hoping to. I've got to write him to tell him about the sale of Susie's book, because I know he'll be absolutely thrilled, and I'm sure he will feel that he deserves at least part of the credit for Susie's successes as well as mine.
You're both protégés too. And
yeah.
Maybe this is where Susie got her misanthropic aiming, or was that there from the beginning?
I think that was there from the beginning, and it's just flowered over the last decade or so.
Yeah. Well, all of this, these fantasies about people being wiped out from Earth, reminds me of all these theories about mass extinctions, coming in these periodic cycles, and like the dinosaurs, and then it's every how many years that they say this happens. I'm trying to skillfully nudge our conversation to that piece in one of the Scientific American blogs that led me to a press release from it looks like the University of Kansas. That says
I didn't know if that was on the level or not. The Scientific American piece was so jokey.
Well, I thought he was making it up. It was kind of it was just sort of one of these, post something you see on the web and make sarcastic comments about it. But I followed the link, and there actually was this discovery. Okay, so here it is. It's every 62 million years is the latest figure where they believe that there are these mass extinctions.
It's that regular.
Yeah, every 62 million years. It says, massive die-offs occur on Earth with startling regularity about once every 62 million years, but scientists have struggled to pinpoint a cause for the consistently recurring extinctions uncovered in the fossil record. Now a team of University of Kansas professors has found the likely reason by looking to the heavens. And
sounds like the old. Remember the old Death Star scenario?
The Death Star
of Alvarez, the great geophysicist.
About the dinosaur extinction.
Yeah,
how did that go?
That there was some. I think the way it worked is that the sun has a distant companion star. And that we are involved in, we have this sort of complicated cycle, but every now and then we pass through we go through part of the cycle where we are much more likely to be bombarded by asteroids that are sort of orbiting between us and our companion star.
Yeah.
And it's these asteroids. The cyclic nature of mass extinctions has to do with this cycle that we're in with the what's called the Death Star. Nobody's ever seen the Death Star. It's just inferred from the fossil record, and I guess from the periodicity in the bombardment of the Earth by meteors and asteroids, or at least the frequency of asteroids.
Sounds like that old theory about the planet Vulcan that was supposed to be pulling the Earth slightly off skew when it's orbit or something. But this sounds like it's along the same lines, except it's a much grander, more cosmic explanation. They show a neat picture here. We'll have to link to it, but of the Milky Way spiral, and then of course the Milky Way spiral is slowly turning. And so our star, the sun, along with the whole solar system, travels, as the galaxy turns. And then it shows this diagram where our solar system also, in addition to going around like this, it's also going up and down, kind of sinusoidally toward what the authors refer to as the north end, or the top of the Milky Way galaxy, and then back to the south end. Very weird idea what north would mean in terms of outer space, but
right.
But it helps visualize it. So
yeah.
Every time it gets to the north, quote unquote, side of the galaxy, this is the leading edge of the whole galaxy itself as it spins around, moving through space, and it's getting blasted with these cosmic rays. Just like if you were on a motorcycle or something, and we're going down the highway at 100 miles an hour. So these cosmic rays then hit the Earth and the whole solar system when it's at the top of this sinusoidal cycle, and then that wipes out a whole bunch of life, and then everything resets and starts over again. Every 62 million years.
That is pretty cosmic. I would think that another possible outcome of all this radiation is that you'd get an acceleration of mutation rates.
Yeah, they do mention that too.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, so a bunch of stuff gets wiped out, like say the dinosaurs, and then there's all these mutations. So your garden overfloweth with all these new variations, and then species emerge out of that, and you have a whole new cycle with interesting new stuff.
Yeah. Wow. This is. It's fascinating. It sounds highly implausible on its face, but
why?
Well, I don't know. It's so out of left field. I thought mass extinctions are, they generally have been attributed to asteroids, of course, giant meteors. So I thought that the last great mass extinction, which took place about 65 million years ago, right?
Yeah.
The Cretaceous, was it the Cretaceous extinction? That was supposedly the giant meteor that hit around the Yucatan.
Right.
In the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
I guess because I've never heard any mention of this cosmic ray theory in the past, when a theory comes totally out of left field like this, being the skeptical curmudgeon that I am, I tend to think very low possibility of it being corroborated over the long run. But it's
interesting. One of the scientists himself, at the end of this press release, says, his name is Mellet or Malat, says, Malat cautioned that in science most ideas are wrong. And said it is too soon to know if the theory is a leap forward in understanding the mechanism of evolutionary biology.
The important thing is to just throw these things out there so that they can inspire entertaining, if frivolous, discussion.
Well, no, so people, this might,
that's true.
Frivolous.
That's true, I know. Hey, listen, in terms of something that I think is actually has a more substantial basis, is this supposed proof of a computer program that has solved checkers.
Oh, yeah.
Did you see those reports?
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, that was fascinating because it's the only game, a common game that I know that they did that before was tic-tac-toe, right?
Yeah, well, tic-tac-toe, everybody knows, is very easily, you can have two people with low to moderate intelligence, and very quickly they will play to a draw every time. They realize that there are certain dumb mistakes that they can avoid.
Yeah. So the idea then is, just to make sure I have this right, so like with tic-tac-toe, if no one makes a mistake and makes the correct move every round, you'll always end up in a draw.
That's right, and that calculation is very simple. Checkers, I was actually surprised. I think of checkers as being a very simple game compared to chess, and it is a very simple game compared to chess. I guess the number of possible combinations in checkers is the square root of the number of possible combinations in chess. So chess, it's something like 10 to the 50 possible combinations.
Astronomical number.
Yeah, and that's, just as a point of comparison, there are thought to be roughly 10 to the 80 particles in the entire universe, subatomic particles. So 10 to the 50 is a big number. In checkers, the number is about, I think in the article it said 5 times 10 to the 20th power possible combinations, which is huge for such a simple game.
Yeah, so 10 to the, what was it again?
For checkers, it's 5 times 10 to the 20th power. At least that was.
So that's a huge number.
And so this program, it's such a huge number that this program, apparently it would have taken much too long to go through all the possible combinations, all the possible consequences of a single move in checkers and figure out what's the optimal move in each case. So they had some sort of strategy for searching for optimal moves that reduced the combination or the computation by a lot, exponentially. And that made it possible, and it still took, I think, what'd they say, 20 or 25 years to do the computation that went into this proof?
Yeah, it was just a vast amount of computer time.
Yeah. It just, stories like that, there's this sort of paradox with these artificial intelligence stories, because the AI people will seize on this and say, wow, look, AI is making tremendous progress. And to me, it shows how difficult AI is because, here's this very simple game with really rigid rules, this tiny little playing field, and yet it took this prodigious amount of computation to figure it out.
Yeah, but then artificial intelligence is taking an entirely different approach, though, where they're not so interested in finding every possible permutation of the game, because if you can do that, you can always make a computer that will beat a human, even if the game is if the game's not one that can always be played to a draw. But with chess, they're trying to find patterns and actual little rules of thumb by which humans strategize.
Well, I think I remember I did a story for Scientific American on Deep Blue, the IBM program.
Yeah, and it does a lot of just massive dumb searching.
Well, that was the program that finally defeated Garry Kasparov in what was it, like 1998 or 99? And I went and interviewed the team at IBM who worked on the program, and they said that it was a combination of brute force, sort of calculation of each possible move and all the possible consequences, which begin to branch out incredibly rapidly. It was a combination of that brute force tactic with these rules of thumb that were gleaned from looking at great chess games through history and talking to grandmasters and so forth.
Yeah, so a little of both.
Yeah, a little of both. And I guess the checkers program also was a little of both. But there was this sort of interesting story behind this program. I guess that the team that created it first tested it against apparently the best checkers player of all time, this guy named Marion Tinsley, who had only lost 3 tournament games over a 40-year span.
Yeah.
And so the people who designed the chess program first played against this guy, I don't know, 15 years or so ago, and he beat the program. And so then they refined it and had a rematch, and he withdrew in the middle of the match. I guess they were coming out to a draw, and he said he felt lousy in the middle of the match, and he withdrew, and he later died of cancer. And there are some checkers fans who thought that the stress of this match between Tinsley and the computer had contributed to his death. So it was this kind of, you remember John Henry, the fable of John Henry?
Yeah.
The guy who had the big contest he was the logger who chopped down trees with an axe and had the big contest with the machine that cut down trees, and he won the contest, but was so exhausted that he ended up dying afterwards.
Yeah.
This sounds like a science book.
It's very poignant. Yeah. But aren't people actually worried now that the interest in checkers, which was already pretty low, is going to fall off even more, since people know that it's basically a solved game, and that you can always win a game against an opponent, because you'll probably know, you're not always going to play with them, but if you don't, it's because your opponent made a mistake, and not necessarily because you're a better checkers player.
Yeah, they
that's not
mentioned
entirely true, but
well, I would think that checkers was sort of, I always thought checkers was kind of a boring game. Apparently, the artificial intelligence people now are taking on poker, which is where literally the money is. And poker isn't even, according to some pieces that I've read, poker is even further from being solved than chess is, or it's even considered unsolvable. But you can still come up with programs that are really, really good.
Seems like poker, though, depends so much on psychological strategy. Psyching out your opponent and bluffing and being able to read human nature and figuring out when somebody's creating like false impressions.
Well, the interesting thing about what's happening now with online poker is that all that is eliminated. So I've got a friend here in Garrison I play tennis with all the time, and he loves playing in online poker tournaments, and he's come very close to winning enough of these things so that he would be invited to participate in the World Series of
so you're not getting any of those human cues.
That's right.
I thought that was sort of the whole appeal, was sitting in this, smoky, smelly, beer-stained carpet room and, playing cards and staring down your opponent.
Yeah, I would think. But apparently, and ultimately, if you win one of these online tournaments, you get invited to the World Series of Poker, then you are facing people, and then then the psychological element becomes really important. And I guess all the great poker players are really good at reading facial tics to tell if somebody is bluffing or
not. Yeah, that's
not.
what I thought. So that's going to be much harder to get a computer to do that.
Well, you could ask whether a computer needs to do that. If it just, you just design a computer to go strictly with the math, then maybe a computer isn't bluffable, and it's got an advantage in that sense. And the human players will have to adjust to the lack of psychology on the part of the computer.
Yeah.
And of course,
I'm really surprised that I had never thought of poker as being computationally complex like that.
I guess it is, and especially if you've got, the more players that you have in a given hand, the more complexity you've got. But according, this was, I'll link to this when we're done. But
I'd like to read that. I just don't know anything about poker, really.
Well, this was a piece in the business section of the Times. It came out just this week after the Checkers story, talking about a first man-machine poker championship. And what was interesting is that they said that the poker program was actually doing pretty well when it was using a strictly mathematical approach, and then the programmers added some kind of learning algorithm that they thought it would make it more clever.
Yeah.
And at that point, the humans kicked the machine's ass.
Literally?
So as soon as they tried to make the program more human-like, then it failed miserably.
Oh, I see. Oh, I thought you meant it actually went over there and kicked the machine and broke it.
Well,
see, that's what a baboon would do, right?
Yeah, right. Oh, man, that was awesome cycling back. Yeah, great way to...
Do you remember the Thomas Bass's book, The Eudaimonic Pie?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
that was
about...
a great book. With some of your Santa Fe colleagues.
Yeah, Doane Farmer, who still lives in Santa Fe, and Norman Packard, who's now... Last I heard, he was in Venice with working on some kind of artificial life experiment. But when they were physics graduate students at University of Santa Cruz, they came up with a way to beat the roulette tables in Las Vegas. And then Thomas Bass wrote this book explaining the whole thing, and it's just a really great read.
I forget, they never really made any money off it, right? There were some sort of technical glitches,
the
and
book's very cagey about that, and there's apparently a backstory to that. The idea was that they realized that, of course, the idea of roulette is when you spin the wheel, it's supposed to be purely random where it stops and where the ball, lands.
Mm-hmm.
But then they realized, well, there's no such thing as a perfect roulette wheel, and if it's slightly tilted, for example, and just not on a perfect platonic plane, it's going to tend to favor one side over the other. Mm-hmm. And they did all this very complex Newtonian physics calculations and came up with some little computer programs that if you, let's see, how did it go? You would see, you would have to note, I guess you'd have to note what position the wheel was in when the croupier, is that what he's called? Spins it. And,
sounds right.
And then you would have to clock how fast the wheel is moving, and then they did these computations, and it would predict which half of the wheel the ball was likely to land in. And then they built all this into a little computer that they could put in a shoe, and they would go to Las Vegas with, and one guy would sit there with the computer in his shoe, and he would click his toe like on a micro switch, when the wheel was set in motion, and each time the double zero came around, and then the computer would calculate which half it was going to land in, and then the signal would be transmitted to the accomplice who was sitting at the table putting down the bets.
Yeah. And I just can't remember. I read that so long ago. I can't remember what happened with the money, but I know that they didn't get filthy rich. And there was a follow-up book by Thomas Bass about some of these people that I'm sure you've read, called The Predictors.
Yeah, they started the prediction company and predicting financial markets.
Yeah, so instead of trying to beat the system in Las Vegas, they're trying to beat Wall Street by coming up with algorithms that are a surefire way for making money off market fluctuations.
Yeah.
And Bass sent me the manuscript for that book, and asking for a blurb, and I read it, and it's a great story, but there is this big hole at the core because, of course, he couldn't describe how the algorithms really work. So
he had to sign all kinds of non-disclosure kind of statements and things like that, and he had a lot of trouble because I think this was about the time that, was it Swiss Bank, I think that's who it was, bought the prediction company.
Yeah. And this was in the late 90s when everybody was making money. So Bass was saying that, these guys were really, raking it in. But, Jesus, even I was making money in the late 90s off the stock market.
Yeah, but the prediction company's still going, though. That's what's interesting.
Is it really? Well, and the question I have is, I think of surefire systems for beating Wall Street, making money, as kind of like perpetual motion machines. I just don't believe it can happen. I mean,
we could do a whole show on this. I just noticed we're heading up toward 107.18 here.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll reveal the secrets of
we should
surefire money making next week.
Yeah, because a lot of this it's not perpetual motion so much as it's finding imperfect pockets of information in the market. If information is not frictionlessly transferred to everyone in the market instantaneously, and you can find these little delays, you can exploit these pockets. And even if you're skimming off, a tiny little percentage, the huge amount of money that changes hands in the currency or commodities markets, for example, you can, it's sort of like Maxwell's demon again. You can do this little bit of computation, fight against the randomness, and get ahead for at least a while. Although, in the long run you may lose, but in the short run you can have a pretty nice house and car and things.
Well, and some people just get lucky too.
Of course.
I guess my feeling is that when somebody comes up with a really good system for doing this, the market adjusts.
Well, yeah.
And this method
you have
spreads.
To stay one step ahead of the adjustments.
Yeah, and of course, insider trading does work. It does make certain people.
That's a whole different thing.
Very wealthy.
Yeah,
but I guess I'm more of a random walk person. I think of the movement. There's so many variables that go into the motion of markets that ultimately.
Burton Malkiel's famous book on that was. That really rang true to me too. But then getting to know Doan over the years and talking to him a few times, he's given me some pretty interesting arguments for why there's some imperfections in that idea, and that it's not an entirely random walk. And if you're clever enough, like Maxwell's demon, you can stay slightly ahead of it. But,
well, and certain people, the success rate of Wall Street investors is not totally random. You've got Warren Buffett and George Soros and people like that who have a record of success over decades. So they must know something. But anyway.
Well, I just noticed, Terry. I just called up the prediction company website, and they're hiring.
great. Blogging heads, watchers.
They're hiring full medical benefits, 401k.
Hey, I bet some of the people who watch Blogging Heads are obviously way overeducated. I'm sure that some of them would be perfect for the prediction company.
They've got some really smart people working for them.
Yeah.
Well, John,
anyway,
it's been fun.
Yeah, all over the place today, as usual.
You've done it again. You've wasted an hour listening to science talk.
And I've had fun doing it. So,
will you be here next week? I forget.
I forget too.
Oh, that's right. We're up in the air on that one.
Yeah.
And then 2 weeks from now, I'm going to do something with someone.
I've got Andy Revkin, the New York Times environmental correspondent, coming up pretty soon.
Good.
That should be interesting. Environmental issues are a glaring omission in our discussion so far.
Yeah.
But anyway.
That sounds great.
So I'll be back in touch over the next week about
that sounds good, John.
Our next chat.
And again, give Susie my best and have a glass of champagne for me.
Oh, we definitely will.